The morning had started like any other in the modest apartment where Nora Sinclair lived with her 8-year-old son Kieran. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon toast, sunlight spilling through the narrow window onto a table cluttered with bills, coloring pencils, and a half-finished science project. Kieran was bent over his cereal bowl, dribbling milk down his chin in his usual absent-minded way as he tried to balance a spoon upright against the rim. Nora smiled faintly at his antics, her heart softening at his freckles and copper hair. Then she noticed the envelope lying among the bills and junk mail. It was heavier than the rest, made of creamstock with her name written in elegant calligraphy. She picked it up, puzzled. She rarely received anything other than bills and advertisements. As she slit open the envelope, her breath caught. It was a wedding invitation from Imogen Frost, her former best friend from college, the girl with whom she had once shared dreams of design careers and a future full of promise. The elegant script announced a wedding at a luxury resort in Lake Tahoe. Nora blinked, struggling to reconcile the image of her ramen-eating, perpetually broke friend with this opulent invitation. Kieran leaned across the table, craning his neck to read. "Who is it from, Mom?" His voice was curious, his steel-gray eyes, so unmistakably his father's, peering up at her. Nora tucked the invitation back into its envelope, brushing crumbs from the table to buy herself a moment. "An old friend," she replied, forcing casualness into her tone. "Someone I knew before you were born. She's getting married and wants us to come." "A wedding?" Kieran's eyes lit up. "Weddings have cake, right?" Nora laughed softly, though her stomach twisted with unease. "Yes, weddings usually have cake." She glanced back at the invitation, reading the note tucked inside. Imogen had written in her familiar looping hand, saying she longed to reconnect, that all expenses were covered and that the groom insisted on taking care of everything. "Please come. It won't be the same without you." Nora poured herself a glass of wine that evening and reread the note. There was warmth in Imogen's words, nostalgia tugging at her heart, yet a ripple of unease lingered. Imogen had never mentioned her fiancé's name in their brief correspondence, only that he was successful, generous, and transformative in her life. Nora told herself it was just nerves, the strangeness of stepping back into a past she had deliberately left behind. Still, she felt the weight of Kieran's curious gaze even after he had gone to bed. The decision should have been simple. She was a freelance designer struggling to keep clients and pay rent. A luxury weekend at a 5-star resort with all expenses paid was beyond her reach otherwise. It would be good for Kieran to travel, see mountains and lakes, taste wedding cakes, and dance under fairy lights. And yet, a part of her whispered that she was walking towards something far more complicated than a reunion. Weeks later, Nora's car wound up the mountain road toward Lake Tahoe. Kieran pressed his face against the window, fogging the glass with excited breaths as he pointed out every deer and pine tree. The resort appeared suddenly, nestled against snow-capped peaks, its stone lodges glowing warmly against the glittering lake. It looked like something out of a storybook. Even Nora gasped despite her anxiety. They were greeted by Belle, the wedding coordinator, who welcomed them by name and led them to a private cabin overlooking the water. The space had been prepared with thoughtful touches. A telescope by the window, space-themed bedding in Kieran's room, and a welcome basket full of snacks and books. Nora felt a strange tug in her chest. Imogen remembered her son's love of astronomy. It was kind, perhaps too kind. Belle mentioned that these accommodations had been arranged by Mr. Lockhart himself, the groom. Nora froze mid-step. The name echoed in her mind like a thunderclap. Lockhart. Her throat went dry. Could it be him? Surely not. It had been 9 years since she had last seen Thaddeus Lockhart, the man who had broken her heart and never knew he had fathered a child. But Belle continued chatting, unaware of the storm inside Nora. Yes, Mr. Thaddeus Lockhart, founder of Lockhart Innovations. He personally oversaw every detail. He wanted every guest to feel at home. Nora clutched the doorframe, her vision swimming. It was him, the same man whose ambition had once burned brighter than anything else. The man she had loved, lost, and hidden her greatest secret from. She forced a smile for Belle's sake. murmured something about being travel-tired, and hurried Kieran into the cabin. That night, as Kieran unpacked his telescope with gleeful chatter, Nora sank onto the sofa, her body trembling. She remembered the last time she had seen Thaddeus, his determined gray eyes, his words about seizing a once-in-a-lifetime chance for his failing company, his promises to return. He never had, or so she believed. In the silence that followed, she discovered she was pregnant, and by the time she tried to reach him, it was as if he had disappeared. She had built her life around that absence, raising Kieran alone, choosing not to poison him with bitterness, but to protect him from disappointment. Now fate had dragged them both into the same place, forcing a confrontation she had avoided for nearly a decade. As she hung her dress for the welcome reception, her reflection stared back at her with fear in its eyes. The boy in the next room was Thaddeus's son, carrying his features, intelligence, and curiosity about the stars. And tomorrow, Nora would face the man who had never known he had a child. The invitation had been the catalyst, but the truth was the storm waiting to break. The lakeside pavilion glowed with hundreds of delicate lights strung across wooden beams, casting soft golden reflections over the water. Music drifted from a live quartet in the corner, their violins weaving through conversations and laughter as guests mingled with glasses of champagne in hand. Nora stood at the entrance, her hand resting lightly on Kieran's shoulder as she tried to gather the courage to step inside. Her simple silk dress suddenly felt woefully inadequate among the glimmer of cocktail gowns and tailored suits. Kieran's eyes were wide with wonder, taking in the glittering chandeliers and the tables laden with food. "Look, Mom, they have little hot dogs wrapped in bread." He tugged her hand with excitement. "Pigs in blankets," Nora corrected absently, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might echo in the room. Imogen appeared radiant in a champagne-colored dress, her blonde hair pinned into an elegant updo. She swept toward Nora with open arms, embracing her with warmth that felt familiar and foreign after so many years apart. "Nora, you came. I am glad you are here." She stepped back, her gaze softening as it landed on Kieran. "And this must be the young man I have heard about." Kieran offered a shy handshake that made both women smile. "It is nice to meet you, Miss Frost. Congratulations on your wedding." Imogen laughed, her eyes sparkling. "Such perfect manners. You raised him well, Nora. He is wonderful." Nora forced a smile, though unease churned beneath her calm exterior. Every mention of Imogen's wedding felt like walking closer to a precipice. She had yet to see Thaddeus. Perhaps he was delayed. Maybe fate would give her a little more time. Imogen led them through the crowd, introducing them to acquaintances and family members. Nora nodded politely, answered questions about her work, and kept her responses brief. She felt like she was moving through water, her focus fractured, her eyes scanning the crowd repeatedly. Then a ripple of hush passed through the room. Conversations faltered, eyes shifted toward the entrance. A tall figure stepped inside, and Nora's breath caught in her throat. Thaddeus Lockhart. He was older now, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, his presence commanding in a tailored suit that seemed molded to him. Success clung to him like a second skin. His expression was polite as he shook hands with acquaintances, but the mask cracked when his eyes lifted and met hers across the room. Shock flashed across his face, sharp and unmistakable. Nora felt her knees weaken. 9 years dissolved in an instant. Memories slammed into her like waves. Late nights in their tiny apartment, whispered dreams of futures they never built, his voice promising her forever. And then his absence, the silence, the unanswered messages. Imogen's delighted voice rang out, unaware of the silent storm between them. "Thad, there you are. Darling, I want you to meet someone who is very special to me." She took his arm, guiding him closer, her expression glowing with pride. "My oldest friend from design school is Nora Sinclair." For a moment, silence hung heavy. Thaddeus stared at her, his gray eyes wide with disbelief. Nora. Her name escaped his lips like a ghost he never expected to see again. Imogen glanced between them, her smile faltering slightly.
"Do you two know each other?" "We met a long time ago," Thaddeus said finally, his voice carefully measured, though his gaze never left Nora's. "Back in New York." Nora forced her lips to curve into a polite smile. "Yes, a very long time ago." Her voice sounded strange to her ears, steady when everything inside her trembled. Imogen laughed lightly, though her eyes flickered with curiosity. "What a small world. You never mentioned knowing Nora, Thad." "It was brief," he replied, still staring at her, his jaw tight. Before anyone could say more, Kieran's voice rang out across the pavilion. "Mom, come quick. They have a telescope outside, and you can see Jupiter's moons." He darted toward her, his face flushed with excitement, his copper hair catching the light. Thaddeus's gaze snapped to him, and Nora saw the exact moment recognition struck. The boy's age, the familiar eyes, the unmistakable resemblance. His breath hitched audibly, his body going rigid as if struck. Kieran tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, is that man staring at us?" Nora swallowed hard, her pulse roaring in her ears. She placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder, her voice barely steady. "We need to leave now." "But why?" Kieran's innocent question pierced the tension. His eyes darted between her and the man across the room, confused by the storm he could not understand. Before she could answer, Imogen reappeared at Thaddeus's side, her hand looped possessively through his arm. "Nora, I see you've spotted my fiancé." Her words fell like a hammer. Nora's world tilted. The air vanished from her lungs. It was true. Her old friend's mysterious fiancé was the man she had once loved, the man who had walked away and had no idea he had fathered her son. The room spun. Guests laughed and clinked glasses around them, oblivious to the fracture opening in the pavilion's center. Nora stood frozen, her son's hand in hers, staring into the eyes of the past colliding with the present. The welcome reception had only just begun, and the secrets she had carried for nearly a decade had already threatened to unravel in the most public, devastating way imaginable. Back in their assigned cabin, Nora paced the length of the small living room, her hands trembling as she clutched a glass of water she had no intention of drinking. The welcome reception had ended in a blur of forced smiles and polite conversation, every moment underscored by the unmistakable weight of Thaddeus Lockhart's gaze upon her and her son. She had managed to keep her composure until she and Kieran returned to the cabin, but the facade was cracking now. Kieran had collapsed into bed after his long day, his new constellation book clutched tightly to his chest. Nora had kissed his forehead, tucking the blanket snugly around him, and whispered a promise that tomorrow would be better. But the promise had felt hollow, because she knew what tomorrow would bring. The secret she had guarded for nearly a decade was unraveling, and there was no way to stop it. A knock sounded at the door, soft, deliberate. She closed her eyes. She had known it would come. Thaddeus would not let this lie unanswered. She set down her glass, smoothed her hair with trembling fingers, and opened the door. He stood there in a simple button-down shirt and dark jeans, stripped of the armor of wealth and ceremony. For a heartbeat, she saw not the billionaire CEO but the man she had once loved, who had held her when the world seemed too heavy. His face was taut, his eyes shadowed, but his voice was steady. "May I come in?" Nora stepped aside wordlessly, closing the door behind him. For a long moment, they simply stood there, the weight of 9 years and countless unspoken words filling the air between them. "He is mine, isn't he?" Thaddeus's question came low, but there was no hesitation in it. It was less accusation than realization. His eyes searched hers, desperate for confirmation. Nora swallowed hard. Yes, the single word hung between them, shattering what remained of the wall she had built. Thaddeus sank onto the sofa, running a hand through his hair, his composure cracking. 8 years old? He asked, his voice raw. 8 years and 4 months, she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. His head fell into his hands. "I was gone when you found out, wasn't I?" His tone was broken, tinged with disbelief. Nora stayed standing, needing the distance and height to feel some measure of control. "I found out 3 weeks after you left for San Francisco. You called and said you had an epiphany and were staying to rebuild the company. You never came back."
Thaddeus looked up sharply, pain and confusion flashing across his face. "Did I choose not to get back to you?" He stood suddenly, agitation propelling him across the room. "Nora, I thought you left me. I called, I emailed, and then you vanished." Her breath caught. "That is not true. I sent you messages, emails. I told you about the baby. You never answered." "I never got them," he shot back, his voice cracking with conviction. "Atlas Holdings had me on their secure servers during those negotiations. Everything went through them. If there was a glitch," he trailed off, realization dawning, his face pale. "My God. You thought I abandoned you, and I thought you abandoned me." 9 years of pain, of resentment, of loneliness, stretched between them like an unbridgeable gulf. Nora felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to remain upright. "I carried this alone," she whispered. "I raised him alone. Every question he asked, every time he wondered about the father he never met, I had no answer that would not hurt him." Thaddeus's expression softened, anguish etched deep into his features. "And you did an extraordinary job. He is brilliant, kind, and curious. I saw it tonight. He is everything I could have hoped for in a son. And I missed all of it." The sincerity in his voice struck her like a blow. He was not the callous man she had painted in her memories. He was a father blindsided by the truth, robbed of years he could never reclaim. Nora turned away, staring out the window at the shimmering reflection of the lake. "He deserves the truth. Kieran deserves to know who you are." Thaddeus stepped closer, his voice gentle now. "Then let us tell him together. Tomorrow. He deserves honesty from both of us." Her throat tightened. "And Imogen? What about her? You are marrying my best friend tomorrow." His jaw clenched. "She deserves the truth, too. I will not marry her with a lie of this magnitude between us." Nora closed her eyes, her heart aching. The storm had broken, and there was no escaping it. Tomorrow, everything would change, for her, for Thaddeus, for Imogen, but most of all, for Kieran. From the hallway, a small voice interrupted the silence. "Mom, who are you talking to?" Both adults turned sharply. Kieran stood in the doorway, his space pajamas rumpled, his glasses askew. His curious eyes shifted from his mother to Thaddeus, recognition dawning. "You are Miss Frost's fiancé," he said simply. "Yes," Thaddeus replied, his voice soft, steady, despite the tumult. "I am Thaddeus Lockhart." Kieran tilted his head, studying him with surprising seriousness. "You came here late. Is something wrong?" Nora's heart pounded, but she forced a smile. "Nothing is wrong, sweetheart. Mr. Lockhart and I were just catching up." But Kieran's gaze lingered, sharp and knowing, before he finally nodded. "Okay, but you promised me the whole truth tomorrow." His words landed like a verdict, leaving no room for delay. Thaddeus met Nora's eyes over their son's head. Tomorrow. Together. And for the first time in 9 years, Nora felt the fragile possibility of truth piercing through the shadows of silence. Dawn bled softly across the lake, turning the water into a sheet of pale metal. Nora stood at the small kitchen counter, listening to the cabin settle and breathe. The coffee maker purred to life. Kieran's constellation book lay on the table, a field of stars waiting to be named. She touched the edge of the page as if the paper could steady her. The night had not given sleep, only a slow untangling of memories until the sky began to lighten. She replayed that moment in the pavilion when Thaddeus had seen Kieran and the recognition had cleaved the room in two. She reviewed the plan they had agreed upon with careful clarity. They would tell Kieran together in the morning. Thaddeus would also speak to Imogen before the day carried them into speeches and formalities. The decisions felt heavy yet precise, like stones set to anchor a bridge. Nora checked her phone and found a brief message from him sent at 4:21. He wrote that he was awake and would arrive at 9. He also wrote that he was sorry for every minute he had not known about their son. The words were simple and unadorned. They did not repair for 9 years, but they were true. With sleepin' when thinking in his dreams. When thinking in his dreams, he slid onto a chair and poured cereal, with the focus of a scientist measuring reagents. Nora sat across from him and waited for him to look up. He did, and she saw the question already formed behind his glasses. She told him gently that this morning they would have a meaningful conversation and someone would join them. He nodded as if he had expected nothing less. He asked whether it was about his father. She said it was. The air in the small kitchen changed like a window had been opened. There was a knock at 9 exactly. Nora placed a hand over Kieran's and then rose to open the door. Thaddeus stood on the porch in a gray sweater and jeans, eyes washed pale by the morning light. He stepped inside with a careful simplicity, greeting Kieran by name and asking if he might sit. Nora set a second mug on the table. The three faced one another like points of a triangle, finely drawn on paper instead of traced in the air. Nora spoke first. She told Kieran that when she was very young, she had loved a man who loved her, and that life had become complicated at a moment when both of them were overwhelmed by change. She told him she had tried to share the news of his existence, and that something in the machinery of adult systems had failed. She did not soften the word failure. Then she said that this man had seen Kieran last night and had known what she had always known. She set her hand on the table and left space for Thaddeus to step into the truth. Thaddeus leaned forward with his palms open on the wood. He told Kieran that he had not known and would always regret that. He told him he should have found a way to look harder and questioned the silence sooner. He said he wanted to learn everything about him and would answer questions with plain honesty, even when the answers were not flattering. Kieran listened without interruption, his brow furrowed in that familiar line that made Nora's heart ache. Kieran began with the practical questions. He asked if Thaddeus would still marry Miss Frost today. He wondered what would happen to their routine if that wedding changed. He asked whether a person could be two things at once, a groom and a father, found the night before. Thaddeus said he did not know what the wedding would become, but that being a father would not be a thing he postponed or placed behind ceremonies. He said he owed Miss Frost the truth and would speak to her after this conversation. Kieran moved to a more private concern. He told them that sometimes his knees hurt and bruises appeared too easily when there were only minor bumps. He said the school nurse had mentioned connective tissue and that he had tried to read about it but had grown tired of the medical language. Nora felt a jolt of gratitude for his courage. She explained again what his pediatrician had suspected, that there might be a hereditary connective tissue condition, and that knowing the medical history on both sides mattered. Thaddeus grew very still. He offered his own history as far as he knew it, recalling a cousin with hypermobile joints and an aunt who bruised easily. He said he would undergo every recommended test, and his family would gather details. Kieran looked between them and proposed a proof of concept in the only way he knew. He said they should test the story of the lost messages like a science experiment. They would write down the timeline and see whether the evidence lined up. Nora's breath caught at the practicality of it. She fetched a notebook and set it on the table. Thaddeus took a pen and began to mark dates. He recorded his trip to San Francisco, the period when Atlas Holdings had required all communications to be routed through secure systems, the period when he had stayed longer than planned, the days he said he had called and not reached her. Nora opened her old email account on her aging laptop and pulled up the sent folder. There, they found the 3 messages from 9 years earlier, time-stamped, intact, with headers that showed forwarding to his personal address set to auto-route through the Atlas domain. They looked at the email headers together. Thaddeus traced the chain of servers and pointed to a missing receipt. The message left her provider, passed to his domain, and vanished into a relay with a generic label rather than a named server. He explained quietly to Atlas that he had used aggressive quarantine for attachments and flagged messages from newly created addresses during that period. He said he could request the archival logs from Atlas and his own company now and would do so immediately. Nora printed the headers and slid the pages into a plastic sleeve like artifacts. Nothing in the proof of concept gave back the lost time, but the structure of the failure was finally visible. Kieran exhaled like a diver coming up. He said that if the machine failed, people could decide not to fail again. He proposed another practical step. He suggested they write down rules for the next 7 days while they figured out the larger plan. He offered simple items: daily calls if they were in different places, a schedule for when they would meet, agreement on who would make choices about school and health. Nora felt her throat tighten. Thaddeus nodded and wrote as Kieran dictated, his handwriting precise and steady. When they finished, Kieran drew a box around the list and wrote "packed" at the top. He underlined it twice and then grinned, and for a moment time returned to a softer rhythm. The cabin phone buzzed with a message from the front desk. Miss Frost requested a private meeting with Thaddeus in the garden by the lower path. The hour on the wall clock read 10:31. Nora met his eyes and saw the flicker of resolve there. He said he would speak with Imogen now, and not speak for Nora or Kieran, only for himself. He said he would return as soon as he could, and that whatever happened, there would be no secrets between the three of them again. He reached for his coat and then paused. He asked Kieran if he might borrow the printed email headers to show the kind of failure that had occurred. Kieran considered and nodded, adding that the papers should be returned, because a scientist keeps his records. The silence felt clean and sharp when the door closed behind him. Nora washed the coffee cups and then sat beside her son. They did not fill the quiet with chatter. She asked how he felt now that the truth had a shape. He said he felt lighter and was sure that both could exist simultaneously. He asked whether people who cared about each other could step back without hurting each other more. Nora answered that sometimes love changed form and kindness was a discipline, not a feeling. She told him he had the right to take his time with his new reality. He told her that he wanted to go on the nature hike with the other children later, and that he also wanted to be there when decisions were made about announcements and schedules. She agreed. The minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Nora kept herself from checking the time more than once each minute by folding clothes and making a small list of groceries they did not need. She was halfway through reorganizing the cutlery drawer when the door opened. Thaddeus stepped in with the precise look of a man who has contained emotion to keep it from spilling. He sat and placed the printed headers on the table. He said that he had told Imogen everything, that he had apologized without excuse, and that he had asked what she wanted to do. He said that she had listened in full and had asked questions that were exact and fair. She had said she would not marry anyone while this truth was unresolved. She had said that the reception would be transformed into a celebration of friendship and that the legal ceremony would be postponed. She had asked for privacy and time. He also said she had surprised him by asking how Kieran was and sending a message that she hoped he would still stargaze tonight. Nora felt relief and grief move through the same small space in her chest. She asked whether there would be questions from guests or the press. Thaddeus answered that a single photo of last night had already begun circulating among technology blogs, and that his communications team had drafted holding language. He said he would only proceed with any statement that protected Kieran and respected Nora and Imogen. He asked for permission to say only that he had reconnected with people important to his past, and that his focus today was on private conversations that placed a child first. Nora agreed with the framing, while insisting on one addition: no names should be used and no ages should be given. He accepted her condition without hesitation. Kieran slid the pact across the table and tapped the line about daily calls and shared decisions. He said that if the pavilion tonight was truly a celebration of friendship, they could use it to set a tone. They would arrive together, not as a couple, not as a broken promise, but as a mother and a father who had agreed to be clear. He asked if they could stand at the edge of the dance floor and not make speeches. Thaddeus smiled with relief and said that sometimes silence was the most respectful answer. They spent the next half hour on logistics, which made the day feel less like a cliff. Nora reserved a place for Kieran on the nature hike. Thaddeus called his office and requested the secure retrieval of archival logs. He also arranged a car for an early morning appointment with Kieran's pediatrician the next day, so that the referral process to a specialist could begin. They wrote all this in the same notebook where the pact lived, not as a performance, but as a ledger of intention. Before leaving the cabin, Kieran handed Thaddeus the telescope manual and asked whether he could help adjust the mount later. Thaddeus said he would, and that they might aim for the planet with the ring if the sky was clear. Kieran corrected him with mock gravity and said many rings and names mattered. Nora watched them barter with the calm joy of people discovering a common language. She took a breath that reached all the way down. They stepped out into the thin mountain light. The lake shivered in a slight breeze, and the pavilion roofs glowed like warm bark. The day ahead would not be easy, but its structure was visible now. Proof had been gathered, promises had been written down, kindness had been chosen on purpose. As they walked the path toward the main lodge, Nora felt the strangeness of certainty return. This was not the life she had planned. It could still be one she would stand inside without apology. The garden behind the lodge stretched in terraces of stone and flowering shrubs, each path winding toward a view of the lake. Morning light slanted through the pines, gilding the air with a fragile calm that belied the tension beneath its surface. Thaddeus walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, rehearsing the words he had to speak. He had faced investors, hostile boards, and government committees, but nothing in his career had prepared him for this meeting. Imogen Frost was waiting for him near the fountain, her posture composed, her eyes unreadable. She did not greet him with a smile. Instead, she gestured to the bench opposite her. "Please sit." Her tone was measured, controlled. He obeyed, lowering himself into place as though he were entering a courtroom. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of water trickling through the stone fountain filled the silence. Finally, Imogen broke it. "I want you to tell me everything," she said from the beginning. "Spare me nothing." Thaddeus drew in a steady breath and began. He told her about Nora Sinclair, about their years together in New York, about the dreams they had built and the abrupt separation when his company nearly collapsed. He explained the messages he had never received, the ones that had vanished into the secure servers of Atlas Holdings. He confessed that until last night he had not known he was a father, that the boy with the constellation book and the storm-gray eyes was his own blood. He admitted the regret that now consumed him, the years he could never retrieve. He did not ask for sympathy, he only spoke the truth. Imogen listened without interruption. She did not flinch or cry. Her eyes remained steady, though her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. When he finished, she rose and began to pace the path, her heels clicking softly against the stones. "So all this time," she said, "you were living without knowing. And now, on the eve of our wedding, everything has changed." Thaddeus stood as well, his voice low. "It has. And it would be a betrayal of you if I pretended otherwise. I cannot enter a marriage built on silence. You deserve honesty, and Kieran deserves recognition." Imogen stopped walking and faced him. There was a flicker of hurt in her eyes and a clarity he had always admired. "Then what happens now? Do you walk away from me? Do you run back to her?" He shook his head. "I'm not here to run. I'm here to be a father. That is the only certainty I have at this moment. As for the rest, I do not know. Nora and I share history, but history is not the same as the future. What matters now is building trust with my son and ensuring he knows he is not an accident or a secret." Her lips pressed together, and for the first time, her composure cracked. "You made me believe I was building a family with you." She turned away, then exhaled slowly. "But I will not chain you to a promise that cannot withstand the truth. The wedding will not happen, not as planned." Thaddeus's chest tightened with guilt and gratitude. "I'm sorry, Imogen. Truly." She raised a hand to stop him. "Do not waste your breath on apologies. What I want from you now is action. If you are to be a father, then prove it. Protect him, not just with your wealth, but with your presence. And protect Nora, too. She has carried this alone. You owe her more than regret." He nodded, humbled. "I will." Imogen's shoulders straightened, her voice regaining its poise. "Then this evening, we will not have a wedding. We will have a gathering of friends. I will stand before them and tell them that life has shifted and the celebration remains different. They will not gossip about a broken engagement if I frame it as a choice of authenticity. That is my gift to you, Thaddeus. Use it well." Silence stretched again, filled with the rustle of pine branches. Then she added, quietly, "He looks like you, the boy. When he smiled, I saw it instantly. He deserves both of you in his life." Her words struck him like a benediction and a sentence at once. He bowed his head in acknowledgement. "Thank you." Imogen gave him a final glance, then turned and walked away, her figure tall and unwavering. He watched her until she disappeared into the lodge, and only then did he allow himself to exhale. The garden felt altered, as though the air had recognized the weight of what had transpired. He returned to the cabin where Nora and Kieran waited. Nora rose from her chair when she saw him, her face taut with worry. "Well?" she asked. Thaddeus set the printed email headers on the table, as though placing evidence in a trial. "I told her everything. She has called off the wedding. Tonight will be a celebration of truth instead of a ceremony of silence." Nora's eyes widened, sorrow and relief colliding within them. And she was gracious. "Stronger than I deserved. She asked only that I prove myself as a father and protect both of you." Kieran listened quietly, his fingers tracing the cover of his book. "So she is not going to be your wife?" "No," Thaddeus said gently, "not now, maybe not ever. But she will still be your friend if you want her to be." Kieran thought for a long moment, then nodded. "She gave me the telescope, remember. I would like her to be my friend." Nora sank into her chair, the morning's weight settling over her. The path forward was still uncertain, but one truth had been established. There would be no lies tonight. They would stand before the gathered guests, not as fractured halves hiding from one another, but as three people bound by honesty and a boy whose eyes reflected the stars. The day stretched ahead with tasks and preparations, but the most important work had already been done. Secrets had been laid bare. Choices had been made. Proof had been gathered in emails and lost messages, and how each had faced the truth without flinching. As the lake shimmered under the noon sun, Nora felt the fragile stirrings of something she had not allowed herself in years: hope. Afternoon softened the lake into hammered silver, while the lodge settled into a hush between preparations. Nora and Thaddeus followed a quiet corridor to Imogen's suite, a corner room with windows on water and fur. A tray of coffee sat between three chairs. Imogen stood by the glass for a long moment, as if committing the view to memory, then turned with the calm of someone who has already chosen. She asked them to sit. Her voice was clear and even. There would be no wedding today. She did not dramatize the fact. She laid the decision on the table like a set of plans. The evening would proceed as a gathering of friends. The ceremony would be postponed without a new date. She would make brief remarks so guests would understand that honesty had changed the shape of the day, but not its meaning. No one else would speak. There would be dancing, there would be light. The rest would wait. Nora felt both grateful and abashed before that pragmatic mercy. She began apologizing, but Imogen lifted her hand and moved the conversation to what mattered. Did Kieran know? Yes, Nora said. They had told him together in the morning. He had asked precise questions and drawn a small sketch in a notebook. He wanted clarity, not spectacle. Imogen's mouth tightened and then softened. That sounded like a child worth following. Thaddeus set a plastic sleeve on the coffee table and slid the printed email headers out. He described the routing requirements during the Atlas negotiations and the relay that had likely quarantined messages from a newly created address. He owned his failures without hedging. He should have checked. He should have returned to New York in person when the silence stretched. Imogen read each line slowly, her finger tracing dates and server names as if they were stitches in fabric. She asked two pointed questions about the timeline and placed the pages back in their sleeve. She said the evidence did not excuse the pain, but it did alter intent. Malice had not been present. Neglect had. Both required different remedies. Then she asked about Kieran's health. Nora explained the bruising and the joint pain, the tentative suspicion of a connective tissue condition, and the importance of a whole family history. Thaddeus supplied what he knew of his relatives. Imogen listened and then revealed the part of her life that did not fit neatly into wedding invitations. She served on the foundation board that supported fertility and pediatric genetics. A partner institute had launched a program for children with suspected Ehlers-Danlos. The program funded comprehensive genetic testing panels, imaging where indicated, and coordinated care with physical therapy. It also protected families with strict privacy protocols and used anonymized data to improve treatment guidelines. Imogen proposed that Kieran be enrolled at once, all costs covered, with Nora as the primary decision-maker, and Thaddeus providing history and undergoing testing where relevant. She framed the offer like a proof of concept rather than a favor.
Phase 1 would verify diagnosis through genetic and clinical evaluation. Phase 2 would create an individualized care plan and begin therapy within 8 weeks. Phase 3 would measure outcomes across 6 and 12 months, tracking pain scores, mobility, and school participation. Consent documents would be plain language. Data would be coded with no direct identifiers. A family liaison would be available at all hours. She offered to convene a call with the program lead and Kieran's pediatrician, Dr. Rowan Hale, to align on steps and guardrails that afternoon. Nora sat very still, and the relief was so sudden that she felt unsteady. Thaddeus thanked her and asked for specifics on scheduling, insurance records, and travel. Imogen had answers ready. An intake slot had opened on Monday due to a cancellation. Remote pre-work could begin tonight. A courier could collect saliva kits before dawn. She showed them a simple checklist on a card. It was not charity, she said. It was a structure applied to care. Only then did she address the storm she would walk into publicly. Some guests would whisper. Some blogs might publish a photo. She had already spoken with Maya, the coordinator. Staff would be briefed with a single line. The ceremony has been postponed, and the evening celebrates friendship. Any press inquiries would be directed to a short statement prepared by her office. No names would be given beyond those on the printed program. She asked Thaddeus if his company would refrain from issuing a separate statement today. He agreed at once and added that any corporate language in the coming week would be limited to privacy commitments and would exclude details about a minor. Imogen asked to see the pact Kieran had written. Nora opened the notebook and turned it toward her. Daily calls if in different places, a shared calendar. Health decisions were discussed with the pediatrician before conclusions were drawn. No appearances in public for optics.
Imogen read every line and smiled sadly. She suggested one addition. A review every 2 weeks during the first 3 months, with the pact amended as reality taught them what the plan had missed. A proof of concept was only as good as its revisions. They agreed, and Thaddeus wrote the new clause in his careful hand. Imogen initialed it beneath theirs. The small act felt ceremonial and exact, like setting a cornerstone. Then she looked from one to the other and spoke about boundaries. Tonight, they would not stand together for photographs. They would not be drawn into explanations if well-meaning friends pressed them. They would not dance as a trio if the floor grew curious. They would give Kieran agency to move between them as he wished and to leave when he wanted. That was the only choreography that mattered. A knock at the door announced Maya, with updated timelines and a comstack of vendor amendments. Imogen reviewed and signed with swift assurance.
Florals would be rearranged to soften a central space for an opening waltz open to all. The band would cut the first set length by half, keeping the tempo bright. The head table would be removed. Seating would be circular to erase a hierarchy that no longer existed. Place cards would be replaced with small cards that read simply, "Welcome." Imogen stepped to the window when they were alone again and rested her palm on the glass. She admitted that she had cried in the early hours and then slept for 40 minutes on the floor because the bed felt like a stage. She had woken with a question. Was she strong enough to stand near the people she loved without being the center of their orbit? She decided strength was practice, not a trait. Today would be practice. Tomorrow will be practice again. Nora found words that were neither apology nor plea. She said, "Thank you." She said that what Imogen built this day would outlast decorations and menus. Thaddeus added little beyond gratitude. The room had no appetite for speeches. Instead, he asked if Kieran might visit for a few minutes before the event, so that expectations could be set with him directly. Imogen nodded and requested that he bring the telescope manual if he wished. She had promised him the stars and meant to keep that small promise, even as larger ones shifted. Kieran arrived 10 minutes later with the manual tucked under his arm. Imogen greeted him at his height and spoke with the same frankness she had offered the adults. The party would be different. She would still wear a beautiful dress. There would be cake and music. He could spend as much or as little time as he liked. If he wanted to show her Jupiter later, she would be honored. Kieran studied her as if measuring an equation,
and then said that honesty improved parties because no one had to keep track of what they were hiding. They built the evening from there like a small prototype. Kieran would arrive with Nora, while Thaddeus came slightly later to avoid a crush at the entrance. Imogen would begin the evening with 3 sentences only. Nora. Maya would signal the band. A few friends would be invited to start the dancing, so the room would not stare at a single pair. If curiosity grew sharp, Kieran could retreat to the deck, where a staff member would help set a small telescope on the railing. It felt orderly in a way that did not deny feeling. Imogen paused in the doorway as they prepared to leave and asked a last practical question. Did Kieran prefer a quiet room nearby if he needed to rest? He did. Maya would arrange it with colored pencils, a bottle of water, and a note saying "Id. This is your space." Kieran nodded gravely as if accepting command of a small observatory. Nora squeezed his shoulder. Thaddeus pressed the printed pact back into his hands as if returning a map to its maker. The corridor outside smelled of wood polish and pine. Staff moved with that particular purposeful grace of an event in flux. Nora felt the odd steadiness that follows a clear plan. Imogen walked beside them until the hall parted toward the garden. She stopped and told them to go and eat something and to rest their faces so they would not look carved by worry. She would see them at dusk. She would hold the room steady long enough for the 3 to step into it without flinching. They parted with no embrace. It was not distance, it was respect. Downstairs, the lobby clock read 4. The lake beyond the glass had darkened to slate. In a few hours, the lanterns would rise, the quartet would tune, and guests would murmur. The proof of concept had been sketched, shared, and signed. It would be tested by human weather soon enough. For the first time all day, Nora believed it might hold. Dusk gathered like silk over the lake while lanterns blinked awake along the pavilion rafters. Staff moved in quiet formation as if guided by a single score. The head table had been removed, and the floor plan had been redrawn into soft circles that erased the usual hierarchy. Cards that simply read "Welcome" rested at each place. The quartet tuned under Maya's supervision and then lowered their instruments to wait for a small signal that would begin the evening. Everything had been altered without becoming chaotic, which was its own grace. Nora arrived with Kieran a few minutes before the hour, entering through the side where a narrow deck opened onto the water. She checked the quiet room Maya had prepared for Kieran. Colored pencils, a carafe of water, and a note that said, "This is your space." Kieran nodded with that grave acceptance that made him feel older than his years. They reviewed the pact together as if reading a flight checklist. He would step onto the deck or into the quiet room if the room felt too loud. If someone asked a question he did not wish to answer, he would say that tonight was about friends. If he wanted to leave early, he would tell Nora or Maya. The pact looked small on paper and very large in practice. Guests began to arrive in a steady glow. Laughter drifted like candle smoke. Nora recognized former classmates, clients of Imogen, and distant relatives whose faces she had never seen and might not remember. Faces turned toward her and Kieran, curious, and then away again when Maya's staff arrived with trays. It felt like a social tide choreographed to prevent any single wave from breaking too hard. Nora breathed through it and loosely kept Kieran's hand in hers so he could withdraw it when he wished. Thaddeus entered by another door a short time later. He wore a dark suit, the tie loosened a fraction, as if he had decided against the theater. He exchanged brief greetings and did not linger in any orbit long enough for a camera to find a straight line. When he reached the edge of the deck, he inclined his head to Nora in a quiet salute that acknowledged distance and solidarity at once. Kieran lifted his palm in a small wave and then let it drop, undecided about crossing the gap in front of so many eyes. Maya gave the signal. The quartet shifted into a gentle waltz. Imogen took the small stage near the bandstand, silver gown catching the last light that slid off the lake. She did not reach for a microphone. Her voice did not need one. She spoke 3 sentences. She said the shape of this evening had changed, but the meaning remained a celebration of care and truth. She said that friendship was not an afterthought to love, but one of its forms. She invited everyone to the floor all at once, so that no single pair would feel the weight of the room. Movement dissolved tension. Couples drifted out. Friends gathered in rings. The opening measure lengthened everyone's spine. Nora felt relief as the hall's focus diffused like light through water. Imogen stepped into the crowd without ceremony and approached Kieran first, bending to his height. Nora watched the exchange from a small distance. Kieran offered a shy smile and pointed toward the deck where the night was clearing. Imogen nodded and said something brief that made him grin. Then she turned to Nora with a look that asked for a moment more. They walked to a quiet corner where the lanterns hummed. She said that the plan was, and that she would continue to hold it if the night shifted. She asked if Kieran wished to set the telescope while people were busy finding the rhythm of the waltz. Nora said yes and felt grateful for the simplicity of a task that asked for hands instead of explanations. Kieran disappeared with a staff member who carried a tripod with practiced ease. Nora remained long enough to hear Imogen tell Maya that if anyone pressed for details, they would be offered a plate, dance, or deck, nothing else. Thaddeus waited near the open doors. He did not intrude. He watched Kieran unfold the tripod and secure the mount with a seriousness that looked like a mirror turned a quarter degree. When the eyepiece went on straight and the screws were snug, Kieran looked up as if requesting permission to decide the next step. Thaddeus approached slowly and stopped at a conversational distance. He asked whether the deck railing was stable enough to dampen vibration. Kieran nodded and rotated the mount with a sure grip. They fell into a conversation that sounded like work rather than talk and drew no attention. The quartet lifted into a second waltz. Nora stepped out for a few minutes with a former classmate whose eyes said, "I am on your side," without demanding proof. They moved through the steps like people who had been taught once and were remembering together. When the music ended, the classmate squeezed Nora's hand and returned her to the edge of the deck with no questions asked. The proof of concept continued to hold under load. A small number of guests drifted toward the deck with the kind of polite curiosity growing around unanswered stories. Maya noticed and redirected with effortless kindness. She asked two to help carry votive trays. She asked someone to find her nephew on the dance floor because his aunt wished to see him spin. By the time the lanterns reached the rail, the knot had undone itself. Nora felt awe at the competence that seemed to expand to fill any gap. Imogen came to the deck while the third piece rose. She watched Kieran align the finder and asked if he would show her the planet with the bright moons. Kieran nodded like a teacher allowing a lesson to proceed. He had been told that Jupiter was visible. He found it with the assurance of a child who believes he can. Thaddeus stood to the side, resisting the impulse to help. When Kieran said, "There you go," softly, in the tone of someone satisfied by evidence, Imogen bent to the eyepiece. She laughed, not showily, but from surprise made clean. She asked Kieran to point out the moons by name. He did, careful and exact. When she straightened, she thanked him in a way that made the thank you sound new. From inside the pavilion, a friend of Imogen struck a bright chord on the piano. The quartet ceded the floor for a single, lively number, creating a ripple of laughter. Nora used the moment to test the following clause of the pact. She and Thaddeus would not stand for photographs together. A guest with a camera drifted near the deck and raised the lens reflexively. Before any discomfort could form, Maya appeared and asked the guest to capture the lanterns from a far angle where the lake would look like a mirror. The guest complied and then forgot what they had been about to do. The pact breathed again. Thaddeus turned to Nora when the deck cleared. He asked if she would walk once around the pavilion with him, not as a statement, but because motion sometimes eases tightness. She considered the optics and the pact and said that a walk along the outer path would be acceptable. They set off at a pace that did not advertise themselves. The night smelled of fir and cool stone. The music softened when they reached the garden. They spoke in brief pieces so as not to spend the night's calm all at once. He told her that his legal team had drafted a short, confidential addendum for his board that would protect Kieran without making him a talking point. She told him that the pediatrician had confirmed a morning slot for intake and that she would attend with Kieran alone unless Kieran requested otherwise. He accepted the boundary with visible respect. They agreed that tomorrow he would visit after the appointment for a short time and then step back so Kieran could rest. The plan grew like a structure where each new beam connected to those already set. When they returned to the deck, Kieran had shifted the telescope toward a bright star higher in the sky. He saw them approach and lifted his chin in greeting. He looked at Nora as if to ask whether more conversation was required. She smiled and shook her head. He had done enough for one evening. Thaddeus thanked him for allowing a walk and said that he had printed the pact again with the new clause from Imogen and would deliver a copy tomorrow. Kieran said that he would file it in the notebook under Day 1 results. Inside the pavilion, Imogen began the only choreography she had promised herself. She glided through the room not as a center, but as a conductor of ease. She danced once with an elderly uncle who cried and blamed it on the string section. She danced once with a niece who had learned a new step at school and wanted to show it to an adult. Then she approached Kieran and asked for a single turn on the edge of the floor. Nora nodded. The room had been taught how to look without staring. Kieran placed his feet on hers for the first measure and then stood on his own. Imogen counted softly, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. When the measure ended, she bowed to him with a flourish, and he bowed back with complete seriousness. The applause that followed was warm and brief, the kind that understands that a moment is enough when it is clean. A lull settled just before cake. Nora felt the ache of a long day reach the edges of her shoulders. She told Kieran that she would step into the quiet room for 2 minutes. He said he would remain on the deck and fine-tune the focus. Thaddeus stayed 3 paces away, close enough to be useful, far enough to be correct. Imogen took the stage for a final time and simply thanked everyone for their grace. No one asked for more. The cake appeared as if conjured. Kieran accepted a slice with patience and then lost patience and ate it with a speed that made Nora laugh when she returned. Thaddeus accepted a plate and ate slowly, as if making a point in his nervous system that there was time now. Imogen tasted a bite and set down her fork. The room was soft around the edges. The final set returned to waltz. Nora felt a quiet invitation move across the floor. She hesitated and then offered her hand to Kieran. He stood on her feet for a few steps and then stepped off and guided her with mouse-like authority. Thaddeus watched from the rail, one hand on the deck post, a small smile held as if it might spill if he breathed too quickly. Imogen watched from across the room with an expression more like peace than resignation. When the music ended, Maya dimmed the lanterns by a breath, and the crowd moved toward the exits with a murmur a little like contentment. The proof of concept had been tested under real conditions. No statements had been made that would injure a child. No photographs had managed to catch a triangle at a sharp angle. The pact was still intact, not because the night had been easy, but because each choice had referenced the plan rather than the mood. Outside, the air had cooled to the point that breath showed. Thaddeus helped Kieran collapse the tripod and carry the mount. Nora thanked Maya and asked after the staff who had managed 100 minor crises before they could form. Imogen stood at the door and said goodnight to each guest with the same apparent steadiness with which she had begun the evening. When the last guest had gone, she turned to Nora and Thaddeus and said that the sky was obvious and that it would be a shame to waste it. They walked together to the edge of the dock, where the lake held the last lights of the pavilion, like constellations set low. Kieran asked if they might find the bright planets again. He put his eye to the finder and smiled in that way he had when something clicked. Nora stood back and let the cold air stitch her back together. Thaddeus stood beside her and did not speak. Imogen wrapped her arms around herself and watched the small circle of light at the end of the tube. The night was not fixed. Tomorrow would be full of paperwork, medicine, logistics, and 100 ways for human error to return. But the evening had shown that intention could be made visible and then enacted. They had agreed on terms and then lived them in public without losing the private shape of care. Under the winter, clear of the mountains, the celebration had become exactly what Imogen had promised. This is proof that a connection could be chosen and then sustained. A waltz that belonged to no single pair and to all of them at once. The resort woke slowly, its corridors still hushed after the long night. Snow had dusted the rooftops in silence, while lanterns burned themselves out. Nora stood at the cabin window with a mug of tea warming her hands, watching the lake inhale mist with each shift of the wind. She felt as though the pavilion celebration had happened in another country, a fragile experiment that somehow had not collapsed under scrutiny. The pact had been tested in public and had held. Proof had been gathered not in documents but in conduct. Kieran shuffled out of his room, his constellation notebook tucked beneath his arm, his eyes brighter than his sleepy hair suggested. He asked if they would still see Dr. Rowan Hale that morning. Nora said yes. She reminded him that the appointment was early, but she also said that he would not be alone. Thaddeus had promised to meet them at the clinic after the initial intake.
Kieran accepted this without fuss, flipping open his notebook to show her the clause he had written the night before. Intake with Mom. Follow up with Dad. Dr. Leeds. He pointed to the underlined words Dr. Leeds and asked if that was still correct. Nora said yes. He smiled and went to dress. At the clinic, the process unfolded with the same measured rhythm that Imogen had promised. The receptionist already had a copy of the program protocol. Consent forms were in plain language. Dr. Hale greeted them warmly, reviewing Kieran's symptoms and history while making careful notes. She explained that a complete evaluation would require genetic testing, joint imaging, and consultation with a physical therapist. She also explained timelines with honesty. Some answers would come quickly, others would take weeks. Proof of concept meant beginning with what could be measured today. Kieran submitted to the blood draw with steady calm, asking the phlebotomist whether his cells would be frozen. She said yes, in part, and explained the biobank. He wondered whether that meant he would live in a freezer. She laughed softly and said only his DNA would. He recorded this in his notebook under vocabulary. Biobank equals freezer for information, not people. Thaddeus arrived after the samples had been taken. He handed Kieran a folder containing family medical records he had managed to gather overnight. The file included a short statement from an aunt who bruised easily, a cousin with joint pain, and his own records from college athletics. He offered them without commentary, simply placing the facts in Dr. Hale's hands. Nora noted the discipline in that gesture. It was proof that he had chosen transparency rather than theater. Dr. Hale suggested a joint meeting for the three of them after the intake. She explained how Kieran's care would be coordinated. She emphasized that parental conflict often did more harm to children than the condition itself. She asked each adult to state clearly in front of the other that medical decisions would be shared and child-centered. Nora agreed. Thaddeus agreed. Kieran wrote it down and drew a box around it. Packed health clause confirmed. When they left the clinic, the sun had begun to clear the mist from the lake. They walked together to the car park, not arm in arm, not distant, but aligned. Kieran skipped ahead to test the crunch of frost under his boots. Nora felt a curious equilibrium settle inside her. The morning was not a promise that all would be easy. It was proof that procedures existed, that structure could cradle even the most fragile truths. Back at the lodge, preparations were already shifting again. Imogen had called a late brunch for the remaining guests. She wanted to close the gathering on her own terms, rather than let it drift into rumor. She welcomed them in a soft green dress, hair loose this time, face serene. She thanked everyone for attending and explained with poise that the wedding had been postponed by mutual choice. She invited guests to see the decision not as a loss, but as a commitment to clarity. The room accepted her words with nods and quiet claps. Nora sat with Kieran at a corner table while Thaddeus circulated briefly before returning to them. He handed Kieran a small gift bag. Inside was a new eyepiece for the telescope, chosen to expand the field of view. Kieran grinned and announced that the proof of last night's party would continue tonight with improved optics. Nora smiled at the phrasing. Proof was becoming his favorite word, a shield and a bridge. Imogen joined them near the end, carrying her own plate. She spoke directly to Kieran about the telescope, asking him to teach her again. She talked to Nora with a warmth that bypassed apology. She talked to Thaddeus with professional courtesy, confirming that her foundation had already arranged for the courier to send genetic samples.
Then she excused herself to meet other guests. Her exit was quiet, without ceremony, yet filled with dignity. After brunch, guests began to leave. Cars rolled down the mountain road. The resort emptied of chatter, leaving only the three of them and a scattering of staff. Nora felt the fatigue of compressed days settle across her shoulders. She knew the next chapter would not be written here by the lake, but back in the routines of school and work. She also knew that the scaffolding had been erected, the pact, the program, the shared commitment witnessed by others. That evening, as twilight folded itself once more over the mountains, they set up the telescope on the deck outside the cabin. The new eyepiece revealed Jupiter and its moons with sharper clarity. Kieran gasped, scribbled in his notebook, and declared that proof of concept had advanced to phase 2. Nora laughed. Thaddeus chuckled softly. Together they leaned over the lens and saw the small orbs gliding around the giant planet, silent proof that orbits could hold even in cold space. When Kieran finally went to bed, the notebook clutched beneath his pillow, Nora and Thaddeus lingered on the deck. The air was cold enough that their breath clouded. They did not speak of love or past betrayals. They said instead of scheduling, they wanted to know how to manage school nights and weekends and ensure that Kieran's sense of home remained constant. Every line felt like engineering, like building a bridge one beam at a time. Proof again, not of reconciliation, not yet, but of collaboration that might one day allow for more. Nora looked at the stars and thought of how fragile light appeared across distance, how easy it was to believe it had gone out when in truth it was still traveling. She wondered whether her own story with Thaddeus resembled that light. Perhaps it was already extinguished. Possibly it was still burning, but unseen. For now, she chose not to decide. She chose only to keep the telescope steady for the boy who needed to see proof that the universe held patterns, that even after years of silence or failure, gravity still worked and stars still rose. The morning after the celebration had not broken them. It had ordered them. It had carried proof from paper to practice. And as the cabin lights dimmed one by one, Nora realized that hope was not a leap, but a sequence of small agreements kept in sequence, like notes that turned noise into music. The days after the postponed wedding moved like slow water around rocks, reshaping channels without noise. The guests had departed. The cabins stood quiet. What remained was not a broken ceremony, but a rearranged life. Nora, Thaddeus, and Kieran lingered for one last morning at the resort before returning to their different cities. The lake stretched before them, bright and clear, its surface reflecting both the snow peaks above and the unknown futures they carried. Kieran insisted on one more round with his telescope. He said the new eyepiece needed further proof. He used the word with precision, flipping open his notebook to record the night's observations and the morning's final test. He listed Jupiter, Saturn, and the faint hint of a nebula. Then he drew 2 columns, things proven and things still unproven. Under the proven column he wrote, "Dad explains physics better than YouTube." Under the unproven column he wrote, "Will we all live in the same city?" Nora read the words with a tightness in her chest that she could not disguise. Thaddeus saw them too, and his face grew solemn. Back inside, the three of them sat at the small dining table finishing breakfast. Thaddeus asked whether Kieran would like to visit San Francisco the following month. Kieran said yes, provided the schedule allowed for the science fair. He had already started building his encryption model and wanted both parents present when he presented it. Nora nodded. She promised she would coordinate with his teacher. She added that Thaddeus should speak directly with the school as well. If he wanted to claim fatherhood in public, the responsibilities extended to calendars and permissions. He agreed without hesitation, making a note on his phone. Later that morning, they met Imogen at the lodge. She looked rested, her luggage already packed. She told them she had arranged to spend time in Europe working on design projects. She said the break would give her clarity. Her voice was steady, her eyes dry. She kissed Kieran on the forehead and asked him to keep showing her constellations when she returned. She hugged Nora and said friendship was still possible if they chose it. She shook Thaddeus's hand firmly, her grip professional but not hostile. Then she left. The car door closed, and the sound of the engine faded down the mountain road. Her absence left a stillness, proof that some choices could be made with dignity, even when they hurt. The drive back toward the city was quiet. Kieran read from his notebook, occasionally pointing out new entries. Nora stared at the road, her thoughts layered between past and future. Thaddeus drove with calm concentration, and the silence between them was less like avoidance and more like respect. When they stopped for fuel, Kieran asked if he could buy a postcard. He chose one with a picture of the lake and wrote across the back, proof that stars look better at Tahoe. He addressed it to himself, a memory sealed in ink. Nora mailed it for him.
Back at home, everyday routines returned with surprising speed. School lunches, freelance deadlines, piano practice, grocery lists. Yet the pattern was altered by new threads. Thaddeus began sending daily messages to Kieran, short notes filled with encouragement or small science facts. Sometimes he called to help with homework. Sometimes he simply listened while Kieran described his day. Nora watched cautiously, uncertain how far to trust the continuity. However, each time Thaddeus followed through, another brick was laid in the foundation of credibility. Proof of concept was moving into evidence of practice. The science fair became the focal point. Kieran worked tirelessly, building a model that combined cardboard, LEDs, and lines of code his father had sent him. Nora helped with the physical presentation, painting the base and labeling components. She found herself laughing with her son as they spilled glue and glitter. She realized how long it had been since she had felt this simple joy. In quieter moments, she wondered if Thaddeus's presence would complicate or ease their lives. She concluded that the answer was both. Complexity did not have to be ruin. It could also be growth. One evening, as Kieran slept, Thaddeus called to discuss the travel schedule. His voice was calm but edged with something more. He said he wanted to relocate a division of his company closer to Nora's city. He said it would allow for more consistent parenting. He asked whether she would oppose it. Nora paused, hearing the layers beneath the question. It was not only about geography, it was about trust. She told him she would not oppose it, provided his intention was truly centered on Kieran. She said she needed proof, not in promises but in actions. He accepted that and thanked her for stating it so clearly. It was the language they now spoke: proof, pact, practice. Weeks passed, carrying them steadily toward the science fair. Nora noticed how Kieran's confidence grew. He spoke often about his father, sometimes with awe, sometimes with simple ease. He never stopped calling Nora his anchor, but he began to weave Thaddeus into the fabric of his world. It was not subtraction, it was an addition. The balance felt fragile, yet possible. Nora reminded herself daily that proof of concept did not guarantee final success. It only showed that success was not impossible. The night before the fair, Kieran checked his notes one last time. He asked his mother if she thought the judges would understand quantum encryption. She said she thought they would understand his explanation, which was even better. He smiled and placed his notebook beside his model. Then he asked the question she had both dreaded and expected. "Do you think Dad will come on time?" She answered carefully. "He promised, and promises are tested in their keeping. We will see tomorrow." Kieran nodded, satisfied. He turned off his light, leaving the room quiet except for the hum of his telescope's small motor repositioning itself toward the stars. Nora returned to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window. She thought of the lake, of the telescope, of Imogen's departure. She thought of how proof had become the measure by which they lived. Not the grand declarations of love or loyalty, but the daily evidence of presence. She breathed deeply, steadying herself for the morning. Proof of concept had carried them this far. Tomorrow would test whether it could stand in front of strangers, under bright lights, with a boy's pride and hope resting on it. And in that thought, she found not fear but a fragile, necessary strength. The day of the science fair arrived with crisp air and an almost ceremonial sense of anticipation. Sunlight streamed through the school gymnasium's tall windows, casting long stripes across rows of display tables lined with trifold boards, models, and eager students ready to defend their projects. Parents filled the bleachers, chatting softly, while teachers and judges moved deliberately through the aisles with clipboards in hand. Nora guided Kieran into the room, his project balanced carefully in her arms. The model of quantum encryption gleamed with neat wiring,
blinking LEDs, and hand-painted diagrams that combined technical detail with a child's imaginative artistry. Kieran adjusted his glasses and set his notebook beside the display, smoothing the cover as though it were a sacred text. He whispered a series of rehearsed opening lines to himself, determined to remember each proof he had written. Thaddeus arrived just minutes later, breathless but present, his gray sweater and careful grooming betraying both nervousness and pride. Kieran's eyes lit up at the sight of him.
Without hesitation, the boy pulled his father toward the display, launching into an animated explanation of how the project worked. The judges paused nearby, intrigued by the confidence and clarity radiating from such a young student. Nora stood slightly behind them, her heart completely yet cautious, watching father and son bond, not in whispers of secrets, but in the open, before strangers, before the world. When Kieran's turn with the judges concluded, applause followed. It was not the kind of polite acknowledgement given to all children. It was genuine, impressed applause that carried weight. Nora caught her breath, realizing the audience was seeing what she had always known. Her son was exceptional, but more importantly, they were seeing him alongside his father. A living proof of concept that went beyond science into the realm of human connection. Afterward, they stepped outside for air. Families clustered in small groups, but the three of them found a quiet bench near the playground. Kieran leaned against his mother, still buzzing with energy, while Thaddeus sat across from them, his expression serious. He waited until Kieran pulled out his notebook and began sketching the room layout before speaking. "Nora, I want to make this official," he said carefully. "I want to be recognized as his father legally. Custody, responsibility, all of it. I should have been there from the beginning, and though I cannot undo the past, I can stand present in the future." The words were not a surprise, yet hearing them aloud made Nora's breath catch. She looked at Kieran, oblivious in his scribbling, then back to Thaddeus. Her instinct was protective, to shield her son from another storm. But there was sincerity in Thaddeus's eyes, the kind of sincerity forged not in impulse, but in tested commitment. "How do I know you will not vanish again?" she asked quietly. "How do I trust this is not another concept that fades when pressure mounts? Because this time there is no distance, no silence, no lost messages," he replied. "This time there is proof you can measure. I am here. I am in his life. I am showing up, not promising. Let me keep showing up until you no longer doubt." Nora considered the word and their simplicity. They were not grand. They were steady. Proof had become their shared language, and it was one she could accept. She nodded, not as consent to every detail, but as acknowledgement that the door was no longer shut. That evening, Kieran's name was announced as the winner of his division. He accepted the ribbon with a beaming smile, holding it high while Nora clapped until her hands stung. Thaddeus stood beside her, clapping too, his pride unmistakable. For the first time, the three of them stood in public as a unit, unspoken yet undeniable. Later, at home, after Kieran had gone to bed with his ribbon pinned proudly beside his telescope, Nora and Thaddeus sat in the quiet kitchen. The night pressed against the windows, but inside, the light was warm. "He will ask more questions," Thaddeus said softly. "About us, about what we are." "I know," Nora replied. "And what will we say?" "The truth," Thaddeus answered after a pause. "We once loved each other, and life tore us apart by mistake. But now we are parents who must decide what comes next." Nora looked at him for a long moment, seeing both the man she once loved and the stranger he had become, fused into a new possibility. Perhaps love could return, or maybe it could not. But what was certain was this: their son needed them both. And that truth was stronger than doubt, stronger than fear. Proof of concept had carried them through secrecy, reunion, and revelation. Now it moved into the harder stage, proof of endurance. The ribbon pinned to Kieran's wall was more than an award. It was a marker of transition, the first public evidence that the family he longed for was not impossible, only unfinished. As Nora reached for her glass of water, her fingers brushed against Thaddeus's.
The contact was brief, not a declaration, not a promise, but a small proof all the same. The silence between them was no longer avoidance. It was a possibility waiting to be tested. The week after the science fair unwound into a new rhythm that felt both deliberate and delicate. School mornings found the kitchen full of measured talk and packed lunches, while the evenings held a steady exchange of messages that now belonged to a family rather than a pair of distant acquaintances. Proof had changed shape again. It no longer meant only surviving a public event without breaking. It suggested establishing methods that would continue to hold when no one was watching. On Monday, Nora and Thaddeus met with a family attorney in a small room lined with books that looked used rather than displayed. The attorney spoke plainly about custody, responsibility, and the kind of paperwork that protects children from the volatility of adult lives. Nora listened with the guarded attention of someone who had carried the entire weight alone for years. Thaddeus listened with the urgency of someone intent on making amends through structure. They were not adversaries across a table. They were builders looking at plans. The attorney suggested a mediated parenting agreement that would establish decision-making, time-sharing, travel, and public boundaries for media and school interactions. They would sign nothing that day. They would draft, test, and revise as their lives revealed the stress points. That afternoon, Dr. Rowan Hale called with preliminary results. The genetic panel had revealed markers consistent with a hypermobility spectrum condition. It was not a simple answer, and it did not arrive wrapped in certainty, but it was enough to guide the next steps. She outlined a practical plan: physical therapy to support joint stability, activity guidelines to limit strain while encouraging strength, pain tracking using a simple daily scale, regular check-ins to watch growth and avoid overcorrection. Nora took notes while Kieran listened and asked 3 careful questions. Could he still climb the jungle gym if he moved slowly? Could he still run if he warmed up and cooled down? Could he still play the piano if he kept his wrists straight? The doctor said yes to all, with caveats that sounded like empowerment rather than restriction. When the call ended, Kieran drew a box in his notebook and wrote that Phase 2 had been initiated. The next day brought an unexpected test. A technology blog published a speculative item that paired an old photograph of Thaddeus at a gala with a blurred image from the pavilion. The text was coy instead of cruel, hinting at personal development and asking whether the postponement of a high-profile wedding suggested a secret. It took exactly 8 minutes for a reporter to email the school office with a request for comment. Maya forwarded the link to Imogen, who sent it to Nora and Thaddeus without alarm or pity, only a brief line that read, "Hold the plan." They met at the school before dismissal and spoke with the principal behind a closed door. Nora explained that Kieran was not to be photographed on campus, and that any inquiries were to be routed to a single contact. The principal agreed and provided a printed policy as reassurance. Thaddeus told the principal that no statement would be given that day, and that any future message would be framed around privacy and child safety only. Then he excused himself and stood by the exit, where he could see but not be seen. When the bell rang and the children poured into the afternoon, the only camera visible belonged to a parent taking a picture of a class poster. The plan had created a pocket of ordinary in a public place. Nora felt the relief like a warm current. That evening, they took the draft agreement from the attorney and set it beside the original pact written in Kieran's small hand. They created sections that reflected the child's language rather than the law. Daily calls were kept unless sickness or travel made them unwise. School choices are discussed first with teachers and doctors, then with each other, and then with the child in age-appropriate terms. Travel notices are given well in advance, and itineraries are shared. No interviews or public statements about the child without mutual consent. They added an aftercare clause for public events. If any moment felt overwhelming, any of the 3 could call a halt, and the others would protect that pause. It looked simple in ink. It felt like a bridge in steel. Midweek brought a message from Imogen. She wrote from a small studio in Paris and attached a photograph of a courtyard with pale stone and unruly ivy. Her words were slim and steady. Work was satisfying. Sleep was improving. She had met with the Foundation's European partners and proposed a microgrant program to equip public school nurses with better screening tools for connective tissue conditions. She asked whether Nora would consult on the design of the kit and whether Kieran might be willing to suggest language a child would find clear. Nora read the message twice. Here was proof that endings could be repurposed into beginnings without erasing what hurt. Nora replied with a yes and added a description of the note cards that had helped Kieran. Pain scales that used rockets rather than faces. Stretch reminders that framed movement as calibration rather than failure. A water bottle with lines that turned hydration into a game of filling constellations. Imogen answered within the hour, already coordinating pilots with 2 schools and requesting a short call. They spoke that evening with a cordial ease that surprised them both. They did not discuss Thaddeus. They talked about tape, labels, and the quiet dignity of tools that work. The next morning, Kieran began physical therapy. The therapist was brisk in a way that made the effort feel logical. She taught him to anchor his joints with small muscles and to rest before fatigue set in. She set a home routine that took 10 minutes and required no gear beyond a chair and a towel. Proof did not roar, it ticked. Nora watched her son concentrate, jaw set, eyes bright. Later in the car, he said that the exercises felt like teaching his body to shuffle cards without bending them. She told him it was an excellent metaphor and wrote it down to remember. Friday evening brought a brief rift that tested their quorum. Thaddeus had scheduled a call with a potential landlord for office space in Nora's city, and the appointment overlapped with a piano recital time that had changed at the last minute. Kieran wanted both his parents there. Nora braced for disappointment and the edge that sometimes follows. Instead, Thaddeus rescheduled the call with a single text with no complaint. He arrived early to help Kieran warm up and sat in the back row with folded hands and a posture that read attention across the whole room. When Kieran hesitated on a measure, he looked up and saw his father's quiet nod. He corrected and finished with a flourish that was more relief than drama. Afterward, he declared that presence was the best metronome. Saturday, they met with the attorney again to review a refined draft. This time, the document contained a new section called Methods of Repair. They wrote what would happen when plans failed. If one of them missed a call, the other would not accuse but would send a simple status request. If a decision needs to be reversed, the reversal will be marked clearly with a reason and a review date. If a public boundary was breached by accident, they would debrief together and rewrite the exposed clause. They initialed each page and then agreed to wait a week before signing. Proof is required not only on pages with names, but also on the days lived according to those pages. On Sunday, all 3 of them walked in a city park where early camellias had begun to open. Kieran ran ahead and then returned with discoveries that felt like gifts. A feather, a leaf with a perfect spiral, a stick the exact length of his forearm. Nora and Thaddeus talked in low tones about calendars and the clinical visit scheduled for the following month. He told her his board had approved opening a small research office nearby. She told him the news made her nervous and grateful in the same breath. He answered that he understood and that he would move carefully, keeping his home in his current city for now, while creating a rhythm of regular weeks closer to Kieran. She accepted the nuance as another form of proof, intention restrained by patience. That night, Kieran asked a question that belonged to the child and to the scientist he was becoming. When would the test be complete? Nora told him that families did not pass or fail the way circuits do, they iterate. He asked what that meant in practice. She said it meant that the 3 of them would keep testing and adjusting until their lives worked more often than they stumbled. He wrote iterate on a clean page and drew 3 circles that overlapped slightly at the center. Then he wrote the word home in the place where the circles met. The following week marched forward with predictable interruptions. A late train, a rescheduled therapy slot, a burst of bored drama on Thaddeus's side that threatened to swallow a day. Each time they referenced the plan and the pact like navigators checking bearings. Each time they discovered that the existence of a shared document made difficult choices less personal. When they argued about methods rather than motives. When they apologized, they did not drown in it. They simply reset and continued. On Friday, they returned to the attorney's office for the final step. The agreement lay printed and clipped. It looked small compared to the days it represented. They read it once last time. Nora looked up and asked a single addition, a preamble in one paragraph that stated the purpose of the document in the language of a child. We are building a life where the child is safe, informed, and loved, where decisions are made in the open, where time is shared fairly, where health is protected, and where no story about the child is told for the sake of anyone's pride. The attorney smiled and typed it exactly as she said it. They signed. The pens did not tremble. When it was done, the room felt ordinary in the best way. They left the office and walked into the mild afternoon. Kieran waited with a book and looked up as if he could sense the shift. Nora told him that the plan had become official. Thaddeus added that official meant accountable, that any part that stopped working could be changed only by agreement and cause. Kieran nodded with the gravity of a judge and asked whether the plan included pizza to celebrate. It did now. They laughed and went to a place that cut slices larger than a plate. Later, as evening gathered at the windows, Nora stood by the sink and watched the last light thin to blue. The terms of care were not poetry. They were not a love letter. They were a scaffold that allowed her to breathe without scanning the horizon for collapse. In the next room, Kieran practiced his therapy routine while counting aloud like a conductor. Across the room, Thaddeus adjusted a calendar entry and sent a quiet confirmation. None of it was dramatic. All of it was proof. She did not know whether the old fire between her and Thaddeus would return. She did not press to find out. For now, her practice was enough. She dried her hands and joined her son, mirroring his movements, so he could laugh at her imperfect form. When he finished, he turned the page of his notebook and wrote that the result was acceptable. Then he underlined it and drew a small star beside the words as if to grant them a light that would last after the house went dark. Spring leaned into the city with clean light and slow rain that left the sidewalks shining. Nora kept the kitchen window open in the morning so the breeze could move through the house while Kieran measured out his cereal and checked the small list on the fridge that he had written in block letters. Stretch. Pack science notebook. Fill the water bottle to the 2/3 line. The rhythm that began as a pact had become ordinary procedure, and ordinary felt like a gift. Kieran's therapy routine fit between piano practice and homework as if it had always been there. His pain scores, once a scatter of high numbers, settled into a narrow band that Dr. Rowan Hale called encouraging. His range of motion improved without overreach. He still climbed the jungle gym, now with mindful steps, and a warm-up that he had taught 2 friends. At the end of each week, he drew a simple graph in his notebook and colored the bars to show which days felt easy and which required patience. He labeled the page not with triumph, but with a word he had learned to respect: trend. The foundation program that Imogen had described at the lodge became real inside schoolrooms that smelled of crayons and disinfectant. The nurse kits arrived in brown cartons and unfolded into clipboards, elastic bands, and illustrated guides that showed how to evaluate joints without fear. Nora consulted on the wording so that a child could understand what an adult was doing and why. Kieran insisted that the pain scale use rockets on a launch tower because the metaphor made sense to him. A regional pilot began with 3 schools and then widened to 8. The early numbers were small but clear. More children were identified sooner. More families received referrals that did not arrive in panic. Imogen sent updates from Europe at good hours and never asked for praise. Results spoke more clearly than applause. On Tuesdays, a small research office with white walls and a single window opened near the river. Thaddeus did not make speeches there either. He flew in for a week each month at first, then 2. He borrowed a desk plant from the lobby and watered it himself. Kieran tracked his father's arrivals not by the flights, but by dinners eaten at the kitchen table, and by pickups from school that happened without fanfare. Presence kept its own calendar. At the end of a month, Kieran added a line to his notebook: calls kept, 29 of 30, pickups 7. Walks after dinner 5. He drew a box around the numbers and wrote the word comfort. The plan found its first real break in the middle of a rainy Thursday. A substitute teacher called during recess and asked Nora to come without delay. Kieran had landed awkwardly after a jump. His knee hurt and looked wrong. Between the call and the car keys, the old panic tried to rise, but the pact cut through it. Nora texted 2 words to Thaddeus: "Going now." He replied with 3, "I am en route." At the clinic, the doctor tested the joint gently and confirmed a minor subluxation that needed rest, a brace, and patient therapy. No catastrophe, no spiral. While Kieran watched a cartoon in the waiting room, Nora and Thaddeus sat side by side without speaking. They did not make a scene or a promise. They adjusted the plan. An extra therapy slot, a note to the school, a quiet weekend. Kieran drew a diagram of the knee in his notebook and labeled each part like a map. Then he wrote a sentence beneath it that made Nora swallow. Proof that rest is work. In late spring, Imogen returned from Europe for a brief week. The 3 adults met her at a small gallery where her students' designs hung from wires like bright ideas waiting to become buildings. She looked rested and steady in a way that did not ask for reassurance. She spoke with Kieran about constellations and asked Nora for a final pass on the nurse kit wording before the summer rollout. She told Thaddeus about a symposium that might fund the expansion of the pediatric genetics partnership. Their conversation moved like clean water around stones that had once been obstacles. When they parted on the sidewalk, Imogen hugged Kieran and touched Nora's arm in a gesture that contained friendship without demand. She shook Thaddeus's hand and said she would send the next set of dates. Then she was gone into the light afternoon, leaving no ache, only a clear space where work and care could continue. June brought a family night at school. Parents and children filled the multi-purpose room with tables of projects and trays of cupcakes. Kieran had prepared a short talk for younger students, titled "Secrets of Stars That Are Not Really Secrets." He stood at the front with a pointer made from a dowel and a ribbon, and explained how to find Jupiter and how to keep a telescope steady. He did not mention quantum anything. He saved that for later grades. Nora watched from a table near the wall, while Thaddeus helped a child adjust a wobbly tripod. A local paper sent a photographer, but the principal held the policy line, and the photographer captured only wide scenes without names. When the pictures appeared the next day, the room looked like what it was, a community. After the children dispersed to chase fireflies in the field, Nora and Thaddeus walked the perimeter of the building. The evening smelled of cut grass and chalk dust. The question that had been waiting between them for months finally stepped forward at its own pace. Could they move from efficient co-parents into another form without endangering the structure they had built? They spoke without grandeur. They agreed on conditions rather than declarations. Any attempt at romance would begin outside Kieran's hours. There would be no sudden announcements. They would review as they had learned to review. They would be brave enough to pause if the experiment threatened stability. They smiled at the language and did not apologize for it. It was how they now understood care. They chose a small test, dinner at a quiet place on a night when Kieran stayed with a friend for a sleepover that came with pizza and a fort and a note from the other parent that said call if needed. At the restaurant, Nora and Thaddeus ordered without performing and spoke about things that did not belong to the schedule, music that had mattered when they were young, books that had surprised them in the years apart, the color of the lake at Tahoe when the lanterns went out. They did not try to reenact an earlier version of themselves. They tried to see who was here now. The evening ended not with an answer, but with a steady sense that answers could come. Outside on the sidewalk, they stood close enough to feel each other's breath, and then stepped back with the patience they had earned. Summer widened the days. Therapy sessions moved to a bright room with a fan that clicked gently as it turned. Kieran learned to tape his knee and to stop before tiredness blurred his balance. He swam slow laps with a smile that looked like relief. He began a project with his father that combined code and cardboard again. this time a model of a simple error-correcting protocol that he explained to anyone who would listen. Nora took on a set of design clients who accepted her boundaries without arguing.
The house felt less like a place under siege and more like a place where mornings could be ordinary. A small news item flickered again toward the end of July. A business section editor tried to tie a minor downturn in Thaddeus's stock price to supposed personal distractions. The story lasted 12 hours before an analyst who had no interest in gossip posted a chart that showed the cause clearly. It had been supply chain issues, not a scandal. The chart made more sense than any sentence. The air went still again. Proof, Nora thought, comes in many currencies. In August, the foundation invited Nora and Kieran to a quiet meeting, where nurses from the pilot schools shared outcomes. One told how a student, who had been labeled clumsy, now had a plan that made gym class possible. Another described a family who finally understood that pain is not weakness, and that careful movement is not retreat.
Imogen sat at the back, taking notes, speaking little, letting the work belong to the people who had done it. On the way home, Kieran pressed his forehead to the window and said that rockets need guidance and fuel and a clear sky. He said the kits were like guidance. He said the rest was up to families and patience. Autumn crept in with cooler evenings and a sky that grew sharper. On a night without clouds, the three of them carried the telescope to the small park behind the house. A neighbor's child wandered over in pajamas and a coat and asked if she could look. Kieran adjusted the focus and stepped aside. The child gasped and clapped, then ran back to her porch to tell someone. Nora sat on the short wall by the path and felt the sound of her own breath settle into a rhythm she had not known in years. Thaddeus stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the star that Kieran had chosen for the evening. No one said anything that asked for more than the moment. When it grew cold, they returned to the house. Kieran fell asleep with the telescope manual open beside him like a book of spells. Nora stood at his door and watched his ribs rise and fall under the blanket. In the quiet kitchen, she found the notebook where he had recorded months of graphs and plans. On the last page, he had written a sentence that stopped her. "Prototype has become our way." She closed the book and let the words settle. Thaddeus joined her and set 2 mugs on the counter. They stood side by side and looked out through the glass at the small square of sky that the window framed. There were still forces beyond their design. There would always be variables that refused to fit neatly into boxes. But they had learned to respond with methods instead of panic, with patience instead of performance. They had learned to gather proof not to win an argument, but to care more accurately. Nora turned to him and spoke in the voice she used when something mattered and drama would only bruise it. She said that she was willing to keep testing a life that included the 3 of them, and perhaps a version of the 2 of them as well. He nodded with the quiet of someone who understood the difference between wish and work. They did not seal the moment with a flourish. They wrote the next appointment on the calendar. They washed the cups. They turned off the light. In the dark hallway, before she returned to her room, she opened the door to Kieran's again. He did not stir. The night was ordinary and reasonable. The pact rested in the drawer where it belonged, no longer an emergency tool, but a culture. The plan with the attorney was in a folder. The therapy exercises had become muscle memory. The foundation's kits would ship to new schools in winter. Imogen would send a picture of snow on a Paris roof. The research office by the river would hire 6 engineers and a receptionist who remembered to water the plant. The telescope would frost and thaw and point again. In the morning, they would wake to ordinary tasks and maybe a small surprise. They would answer with the structure they had built, with kindness chosen on purpose. The project that began with shock and a rehearsal dinner had passed through proof and into practice. It was not finished, it was alive. And in the soft dark of the house, that felt like enough.